My experiences camping in remote areas have always stayed with me. The feeling of isolation, the eerie silence, and the constant reminder that we are at the mercy of nature. These are things I'll never forget. There's a distinct kind of tension that comes with camping in these places. But one trip in particular stands out. It was the scariest I've ever experienced, and it wasn't because of anything supernatural. It wasn't because of creepy creatures lurking in the trees or anything out of a horror movie. It was just a mix of nature's power, the unknown, and an unsettling human presence. I was out with my wife on one trip, camping in a forest full of jack pines. This forest, dense with tall, slender trees, had a haunting quality. The wind howled through the branches, making a creaking sound that always seemed too loud for comfort. We'd been camping in various places over the years, but this one felt different. Maybe it was the wind or the isolation. There was something about this place that made it feel wrong. We set up our camp near a small clearing, the sounds of the forest surrounding us. The ground was soft, and the smell of fresh pine was thick in the air. We set up our tent, started a fire, and went about our evening routine. Everything was peaceful until the wind started picking up around midnight. At first, it was just a little breeze, but by the time we were lying in our sleeping bags, it was a full-blown windstorm. The tent flapped violently against the wind, and I could hear the sound of trees groaning under the pressure. The fire we had so carefully set up sputtered and nearly went out. I thought about getting up to feed more wood to it, but then the wind came howling through, making it almost impossible to keep the flames from blowing out. The trees around us swayed, and I could hear branches snapping in the distance. The feeling of the forest being alive, shifting in the storm, made me uneasy. We had to keep our voices low, trying to reassure each other. But as the storm raged on, my mind raced. The wind seemed almost intentional, almost as if nature was actively trying to push us out of this place. It wasn't just the storm. It was the trees, the sound of them cracking under pressure, the way the pines creaked and groaned like they were trying to speak. The storm raged all through the night, and there were moments when I thought the wind would tear the tent apart. But somehow the storm passed. The wind died down, the night fell silent again, and the moon peeked through the clouds, casting long shadows over the forest floor. We didn't sleep much that night, and in the morning we packed up early. I felt a strange sense of relief when we left that campsite behind. But it wasn't just this trip that stuck with me. There was another time, just a few weeks later, when I went camping with my best friend. This trip was different, more remote, more isolated. We were in a camping area that was technically accessible by a car, but only if you had a 4x4 vehicle. The place wasn't maintained much. There were a few dilapidated picnic tables, a couple of fire pits, and an outhouse that looked like it hadn't been used in years. It was the kind of place where you'd be lucky to see anyone else during the entire trip. We were just happy to be out there, away from the usual chaos of life. After setting up camp, we went about our usual routine, getting the fire going, unpacking gear, and settling in. Everything seemed fine, but my friend wandered off to the outhouse a little while later. He came back a few minutes later with a strange look on his face. "Go check out the first outhouse," he said. I thought maybe someone had made a mess in there or that something had died. Animals, you know. It was a rundown place, so it wasn't too far-fetched. But when I went over there and opened the door, I was immediately hit with a strange smell, one that I couldn't quite place. Inside, stacked neatly against the walls, were 3 large backpacks. These weren't just any backpacks. These were the kind of bags you'd use for week-long trips, the kind of bags that are designed to hold everything you could possibly need in the wild. Curious, I opened them up. 2 of them were full of high-quality outdoor gear, tents, sleeping bags, first aid kits, cooking equipment, everything you could think of for a serious camping trip. But it was the 3rd bag that really threw me off. This bag was full of Skittles. Not just one kind, but a variety of flavors. Regular, tropical, sour, every single flavor and size of Skittles imaginable. Bulk bags, small bags, regular-sized ones. All of them were stuffed into the backpack, filling it to the brim. It didn't make any sense. Why would anyone pack so much candy, let alone leave it behind in a remote outhouse? We stood there, staring at the bags for what felt like an eternity, not knowing what to make of it. We stayed for the next 4 days, exploring the area, hiking, and just trying to enjoy the peace. But that sight, the sight of those backpacks, filled with nothing but Skittles, lingered in my mind. There were no other signs of life, no other campers, no signs of anyone passing through. Just those backpacks, left behind in the outhouse. When we left, we informed the authorities, but the mystery of why anyone would leave such a strange stash behind never got answered. To this day, I still don't know what to make of it. The whole thing felt wrong, like we had stumbled across something we weren't supposed to see. Then there was the time I went camping with my dog. It wasn't planned, just a spur-of-the-moment trip. I grabbed my pack, a tarp, and a small fire kit, not expecting much. I set up a small shelter, made a little fire, and settled in for the night. I wasn't far from the road, but I wasn't close enough to be visible either. It was quiet, peaceful. But as the night wore on, things took a turn. I heard a truck engine roar in the distance, and then the unmistakable sound of drunken voices. They were close, too close. My first instinct was to stay quiet, not let them know I was nearby. But then the shooting started. I was trying to make sense of it. The voices were slurring. The sound of guns firing echoed through the woods, and I realized that they were getting closer. There was no way to know if they knew I was out there, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. The terrain of the land made me feel like they were shooting in my direction. I grabbed my dog, leashed him tightly, and quickly packed up my stuff. My heart raced as I moved quickly through the woods, trying to get as far away from the shooting as possible. The last thing I wanted was to find myself in the middle of some reckless, drunk encounter with people who weren't in their right minds. It wasn't just the fear of the shooting. It was the sudden, unnerving sense that I wasn't alone in the woods anymore. I never figured out who those people were or what they were doing. I didn't stick around to find out. I didn't care to. I just wanted to get back to safety, away from whatever mess I had accidentally walked into. That night, when I finally made it back to my truck, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I didn't sleep much that night, but I did feel better once I was out of the area. Looking back, I realized just how vulnerable I was out there. We often think we're alone in nature, but the reality is, nature has a way of throwing unexpected dangers our way. Whether it's the power of the wind or the unpredictability of human behavior, camping in remote places carries a certain risk. And sometimes, it's not the wild animals or the weather that are the scariest. It's the people who share those spaces with us. Every summer, my family and I went camping. It was our thing. We didn't have the kind of money that allowed for extravagant vacations, but we didn't mind. We were happy with the simplicity of nature. We bounced between Virginia Beach, Assateague, and a place that, even as a child, I knew was the least enjoyable of all, Westmoreland. But Assateague was different. It had its charms, the beach, the sand dunes, the wild ponies, and the sound of the waves crashing at night. Those trips are the ones I remember most, even if that one trip to Assateague still sends a chill through me. It started like any other trip. We packed up the car, loaded the tents and coolers, and made our way to the campground near the beach. The summer heat was heavy, and the salty air mixed with the scent of sunscreen and bug spray. We set up camp with the usual familiarity. One tent for my parents, one for me and my brother. We were close enough to the beach that we could hear the waves, and we could even see the moonlight dancing on the water when the night was clear. We arrived in the afternoon, and the evening was spent making a fire, grilling hot dogs, and chatting about the week ahead. As the night wore on, my parents tucked us into our sleeping bags and zipped the tents shut. The air had cooled down a little, but not enough to make it uncomfortable. I remember feeling cozy, the smell of salt water still fresh on my skin, and the occasional crackle from the fire that had almost died down. I drifted off to sleep to the rhythm of the waves, the sound I had come to associate with peaceful nights by the sea. But, as is the way with camping, things don't always stay peaceful. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sudden shift in the air, a presence in the tent that I couldn't explain. The moonlight filtered in through the small gaps in the tent, casting everything in a pale, almost eerie glow. I was still half dreaming when I felt my mom shift beside me. At first, I thought it was just the usual movement of someone getting up in the night, but then I noticed something was off. My mom was sitting up straight, completely still, her eyes wide, staring directly ahead. Her stillness made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear the fog of sleep from my brain. I looked around, trying to make sense of the situation. That's when I saw it. Just outside the tent, illuminated by the moonlight, was the unmistakable silhouette of an old woman. The figure stood eerily still, its long, wiry hair blowing gently in the wind. The shape was vaguely hunched, and the figure seemed to peer into our tent, its head cocked at an odd angle. It was as if she was looking for something, or maybe even someone. The silhouette was too distinct to be mistaken for anything else, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I could feel my heart beating in my chest, thumping hard enough to make my ears ring. I didn't understand what I was seeing, and the confusion only made the fear worse. I had been camping enough to know that no one should be walking around the campground at this hour, certainly not in the dark, and especially not someone who looked so strange. I tried to call out to my mom, but my voice wouldn't work. My throat was tight, and no sound came out. I reached for her arm, tapping her gently, but she didn't react. The only thing I could do was stare at the figure, frozen in place, too scared to even breathe too loudly. I didn't understand what was going on. I thought maybe it was a ghost, or maybe someone had gotten lost in the woods and ended up by our camp. My mind raced through possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. After what felt like an eternity, I finally broke the silence. I asked my mom, in a hushed whisper, "What is that? Who is outside?" The question, although quiet, was enough to disrupt the stillness in the air. The figure outside flinched. The movement was subtle, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. In an instant, the silhouette turned and started walking away, disappearing into the darkness. My mom finally moved, snapping out of whatever trance she had been in. I could see her eyes now, wide with confusion and fear, matching my own. I still couldn't wrap my mind around what had just happened. My mom and I lay there in the silence for a moment, listening to the wind rustling the leaves outside, the sound of waves crashing far off in the distance. My heart was still pounding in my chest, my breath shallow. The weirdest part was that the figure hadn't seemed like a person. It had been off somehow. It wasn't just the way it looked, it was the way it moved. The way it had stood outside the tent for so long, not making a sound. Everything about it felt wrong. And yet, as the seconds ticked by, that strange feeling of unease started to fade, replaced by confusion. Maybe it had been a trick of the light, I thought. Maybe I had been half asleep, and it was a shadow playing games with my mind. But then, just as I was starting to convince myself it was nothing, I heard something else. Hooves, quiet at first, but unmistakable. Hooves tapping against the ground, steadily getting closer. I sat up, heart pounding again, when the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The shape that had been outside our tent wasn't an old woman at all. It was a pony, a wild pony. I had seen them before. Assateague Island is famous for its feral ponies, and we had camped here enough times to know that they roamed the island freely. But what made this moment so terrifying was that the pony had been standing right outside our tent in the middle of the night, peering in at us like it was watching. It wasn't a person at all. It was a wild animal, one of those ponies doing what it always did, roaming. By the time I realized what had happened, I was already feeling a little foolish. My mom must have realized it at the same time. The moment the pony moved out of our view, we both exhaled in relief. I could feel my heart rate slowly returning to normal as I lay back down. I still felt uneasy, but the terror that had gripped me just moments ago started to dissipate. We stayed silent for a long time, the kind of silence that stretches between two people who are both processing the same terrifying thought. But as I listened to the hooves tapping in the distance, my fear slowly morphed into understanding. The pony had simply been curious about the tents, just like the others that roamed the island. We had set our tent up right in the middle of one of their well-worn trails. They passed through the camp every night, heading toward the beach for whatever reason they had. likely just to graze or wander. By morning, the fear had mostly faded. We both laughed a little nervously when we discussed the event. My mom even mentioned how silly we had been, thinking it was some kind of spirit or something. But deep down, I knew that night had felt different. The way the pony had stood outside our tent, so still, so deliberate, it had felt like it knew exactly what it was doing. We spent the rest of the trip like we usually did, enjoying the beach, hiking, and exploring. But every time I saw a pony near the campground, I couldn't help but remember that night. The way it had watched us, the stillness in its stance, the unnerving way it lingered just outside our tent. I could never quite shake the feeling that, in that moment, it was more than just a wild animal. It was something far too aware of its surroundings. Something that, in its own way, might have known exactly what it was doing. And so, whenever I think back to that trip, I don't just remember the fun and the laughter. I remember the moonlight, the terror, and the wild ponies. Because sometimes, the most unsettling things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're just the creatures that walk among us, quiet and unnoticed, until the moment we make ourselves aware of them. I've spent a lot of time on military bases, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that animals on those bases are entirely different than what you'd find in the wild or in more civilian areas. I'm not talking about the typical deer or raccoons that you see in other places. No, I'm talking about the military animals. They've seen things, they've been around, they've figured out the rules, and they know exactly how far they can push things without getting into real trouble. And the thing is, they're not afraid of us. In fact, they've learned to treat us like we're just part of the background noise. Deer are a prime example. You know how you're supposed to be careful when driving through wooded areas because a deer could dart out in front of you? Well, not on a military base. On a military base, you'll find deer just strolling around like they own the place. No fear. They walk through the training fields, around the barracks, and even past the vehicles with no urgency. They don't even bother moving when you get close. It's like they know that no matter how much we want to chase them or spook them, there's nothing we can do. It's against the rules to harm them, so they're safe. They've figured that out. And when you see a deer walking through a field with its head held high, looking at you like it's the one in charge, you start to realize just how different these animals are. They're practically untouchable. And then you've got the raccoons. Oh man, don't even get me started on the raccoons. If civilian raccoons are known for being little scoundrels, military raccoons are something else. These guys don't just break into garbage cans. They're like little tactical operators. They've been around enough to know that they can get away with damn near anything. I've seen raccoons on base walking around like they're employees. They'll sit on top of your truck, casually licking their paws, completely unfazed by the fact that you're glaring at them. They've got no fear. They know exactly what they're doing. And they know that they're not just any animals. They've got special privileges because nobody's going to mess with them. I remember one night in particular when I learned just how far these raccoons would go. We were in the middle of a field exercise, training hard under the stress of having little to no sleep, long hours, and endless drills. It was the kind of exercise that wore you down mentally and physically. We were exhausted. So, like most nights, we set up camp. We were tired, hungry, and desperate for a good meal, so we made sure we had plenty of MREs to get us through the night. Now, we had a few trucks parked nearby, including an LMTV, a military transport vehicle, where we'd stashed most of our MREs. The plan was simple: eat, rest, and get back to work. We were getting ready to dig into our meals when we heard something that stopped us cold. A loud crash, followed by the sound of something scrabbling around inside the truck. We all looked at each other in confusion. Was that a person? Did someone break into the truck? I was already half standing up when one of the drill sergeants bolted out of the tent, his face a mix of frustration and panic. He shouted, but I couldn't make out the words over the sound of chaos coming from the back of the LMTV. At first, I thought maybe it was someone trying to steal from the truck. Maybe another soldier had gotten a little too eager for food. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of little paws, rapid and frantic, scrambling against metal. And that's when I saw it. One raccoon, then another, and another, all of them darting in and out of the back of the LMTV, their tiny hands clutching the MREs like they were gold bars. They were quick, silent, and coordinated. They had obviously done this before. It wasn't the first time they'd raided a stash of food. They were moving like a well-oiled machine, each raccoon grabbing a pack of MREs and running off into the darkness with an impressive level of teamwork. It was like they had a plan. I glanced over at the drill sergeant, who was now in full panic mode. His face had gone pale, and he was shouting at the raccoons, waving his arms and firing off blanks from his M16. But it was clear the raccoons weren't bothered in the slightest. They kept going, unbothered by the noise, undeterred by the chaos. One of the raccoons actually stopped mid-run, turned back to look at him, and blinked, like it was just a casual glance to check if he was still making a scene. And then, without hesitation, the little beast darted back into the LMTV and snatched another MRE. It was honestly hard not to laugh at the situation. Here was this tough-as-nails drill sergeant who could handle any real threat, but was completely helpless against a group of raccoons. The raccoons continued their raid, moving in and out, grabbing whatever they could. Some of them scurried under the truck, while others leapt onto the roof, seemingly with an almost military-like precision. I couldn't believe what I was witnessing. I thought I'd seen it all, but this was something new, something I would never forget. By the time the drill sergeant gave up trying to scare them off, the raccoons had successfully made off with several armfuls of MREs, disappearing into the trees. It was over as quickly as it had begun. After everything calmed down, the drill sergeant stood there, fuming and muttering under his breath. I could tell he was trying to process the situation, but there wasn't much to say. He couldn't yell at the raccoons. Hell, they weren't even afraid of him. The idea of being bested by a bunch of wild animals wasn't something he'd ever imagined. But there it was. The raccoons had won. We all got back to our campfire, but the mood had definitely shifted. No one was in the mood to joke, but there was this tension hanging in the air. It was the weirdest thing to experience, the great big military machine with all its power and might, brought down by a group of raccoons. It was almost comical, but we all knew better than to mess with them. They had their own way of living in the world of the military base, and they weren't going to be stopped by anything. That night, as I lay there trying to fall asleep, I couldn't help but giggle to myself every time I thought back to the image of the drill sergeant, red-faced and yelling, while the raccoons took off with armfuls of MREs. I never would have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. In the end, we didn't get our MREs back. We didn't really get much of anything. But I'll tell you one thing, we definitely learned that night that on a military base, animals don't play by the same rules as the rest of us. They've figured out the system. They know what they can get away with, and they're not afraid to take advantage of it. The raccoons had won, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. To this day, I still laugh when I think about that drill sergeant's face. We were all humbled that night by nature itself and the most unexpected of enemies, the military raccoons. I spent a lot of time in the woods of upstate New York during my time in the Army. There's a unique kind of peace that comes with the isolation, especially when you're out in the wilderness, far away from the noise of the city. But that peace never lasted long. It always had a way of being disturbed by the weirdest things. If it wasn't the unrelenting cold or the constant noise of insects, it was the animals. And I mean animals in a way that you might not expect. We had been doing a long field exercise, training in the thick forests of upstate New York. The kind of training where you carry everything you need on your back. Gear, food, water, everything. The kind of training that gets you used to being on edge, hyper-aware of your surroundings. And the woods were always alive with sounds, especially at night when everything seemed to be magnified. The nights in those woods were something else. The chill would creep in, and it would be so quiet that you could hear the tiniest sounds, like leaves shifting in the wind or the soft rustling of animals moving around. On those nights, I would try to sleep with my body armor on just in case, but the rest of the squad would lay down their gear and try to get some rest, pulling up their sleeping bags around them. I remember waking up to the sound of something moving around me in the dark. At first, it was just a vague noise, a little crunching of leaves or something brushing up against my kit. But then, I felt something shift right next to me, and the unmistakable sound of zippers moving caught my attention. I opened my eyes, but the darkness was so thick that I couldn't see anything beyond the dim outline of my tent. I felt my heart start to pound a little faster. That sound, the zipper, it wasn't the wind. It wasn't the usual forest noises. Something was actually moving through my gear. I lay there still, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. My mind raced with thoughts of animals, maybe a deer or even a bear. But then I realized that the sound was too controlled, too specific. Something was actually rummaging through my kit. I didn't move right away. I held my breath and waited, trying to listen for any sign of what it might be. The sound of the zipper slowly sliding open continued. Then the unmistakable sound of something grabbing at the contents of my pouch. My mind went wild. I knew that wild animals could be curious, especially in the dead of night, but this wasn't random rummaging. This was too deliberate. This was as if whatever it was knew exactly what it was looking for. My body armor had these pouches that held everything from extra magazines to my emergency first aid kit. A small part of me wanted to jump up, but another part of me knew that if I startled whatever it was, it would just run off and I'd lose track of it. So I stayed still. The zipper slowly moved again, and I could hear the soft scrape of the pouch being pulled open, like something was carefully going through my gear. My thoughts immediately went to my rifle, my ammunition. If this was something serious, I needed to act fast. But again, I stayed perfectly still, willing myself to focus. And then, as I lay there, straining to hear, I caught the sound that made my blood run cold. A soft, chittering noise, almost like a chuckle. The sound was so out of place that it made me freeze completely. It wasn't the noise of a deer or a bear, and it wasn't the wind. It was something small, something quick, something organized. I couldn't help but hold my breath, my heart hammering in my chest. I tried to move slowly, to inch my hand toward my rifle, but every tiny movement I made seemed to set off another sound. The last thing I wanted was to make noise and alert whatever was out there. The sound of the zipper stopped for a moment, and I could hear soft feet shuffling around. And then I felt the unmistakable weight of something brushing against my side. I gasped softly and immediately froze again. It wasn't a big animal. I didn't feel the heavy pressure of a bear or a moose. It was light, nimble, and then the unmistakable sound of claws scratching at the fabric. This wasn't a normal animal encounter. Something was stealing my stuff, going through the pockets of my body armor, looking for something it could take. I finally managed to open my eyes just enough to make out a dark shape moving around my kit. It was a raccoon. It's funny now, but back then, I remember being absolutely stunned by it. This wasn't some random animal trying to scavenge. This raccoon was working with a purpose. It was moving between the pouches of my gear, unzipping them one by one with astonishing precision. It was like it had done this 1,000 times before, and the more I watched it, the more I became certain of something else. This wasn't just one raccoon. It was a whole team. I could hear more rustling from around the camp, and my thoughts raced. There were at least a couple more of them, maybe even more, moving around. It was as if they had organized themselves into a small unit. The way they moved, quick, methodical, and almost choreographed, was beyond anything I had ever seen from wild animals before. These weren't just raccoons. They were like little soldiers. I was now absolutely sure there was a leader among them. I didn't see it at first, but I could feel it. There was one that wasn't moving to steal anything but was instead standing guard. It was huge, the biggest raccoon I'd ever seen, sitting outside the circle of our camp, watching everything closely, its eyes glinting in the dark like sentinels keeping track of every movement. This leader never moved from its spot, but it controlled everything. I swear to this day that this raccoon was giving out signals, almost like it was commanding the others. Every time one of the smaller ones would stop rummaging through a kit, it would dart its eyes over to the leader, waiting for some sort of sign before continuing its work. I was paralyzed with a mixture of disbelief and dread. I couldn't fathom what I was seeing. A whole raccoon army working in perfect coordination like some kind of wildlife special ops. I couldn't do anything. If I moved, I'd risk scaring them off, and I couldn't let that happen. Not when I had no idea how many more were out there. And honestly, I wasn't sure how much of my gear they had already stolen. Eventually, the raccoons stopped and backed off. The leader gave one last look around, scanning the camp with a beady, calculating gaze, and then they all disappeared into the night. When the adrenaline finally wore off, I couldn't believe what had just happened. I didn't know whether to laugh at the absurdity of it all or just feel utterly violated by these sneaky creatures. But one thing was clear, these weren't just any animals. They weren't scavenging for food or looking for scraps. They were after something specific. In the morning, I checked my gear. Sure enough, some of my pouches had been opened, some of my tools were missing, and my first aid kit had been thoroughly raided. The raccoons had stolen exactly what they wanted, and in a way that made me feel like they knew exactly what they were doing. I didn't find any signs of physical damage to my kit, but the small things, the little things they took, felt like a personal violation. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd believe unless you saw it with your own eyes. I still swear to this day that those raccoons were organized, and that there was a leader, a huge, hulking beast of a raccoon, that was directing the whole operation. It wasn't a funny story then. In that moment, it felt like something I couldn't explain. How did they know what to do? How did they know where everything was? As ridiculous as it sounds now, I think it was the first time I felt truly vulnerable out there in the woods. And to this day, when I hear the rustling of leaves or the sound of a zipper in the dead of night, I can't help but wonder if I'll wake up to see another group of raccoons, silently going through my things again, working under the cover of darkness, like little bandits on a mission. I've always loved camping in remote areas. There's something about the quiet and the stillness that gets into your bones. The way the stars seem to shine brighter when you're far from city lights, the scent of the earth and the trees, the feeling that you're the only one for miles around. But tonight, it felt different. It felt like we weren't alone, though we couldn't quite place why. We had been hiking for hours, our feet sore and tired, but the excitement of being so deep in the wild kept our spirits high. When we finally made camp, it was already dusk, and the air had that familiar crispness of an approaching nightfall. We got a fire going, the flames crackling and snapping as we set up our tents. The night was cold, but the fire warmed us enough that we could sit around it comfortably, roasting food, sipping on water, and just enjoying the deep peace of being away from everything. I don't know why, but my mind was racing more than usual that night. Maybe it was because I'd heard stories about the wildlife around here, things that seemed too crazy to be true, like the fact that rhinoceroses are notorious for putting out fires. I had no idea if it was true, but I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy every time I thought about it. I'd read somewhere that they were like the firefighters of Africa, known for marching up to fires and snuffing them out, like they could sense the danger and were trying to help. Whether it was fact or myth, the idea of a giant, horned animal coming in the middle of the night to trample through our camp in an attempt to extinguish our fire wasn't exactly comforting. The fire was a comforting presence, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just the usual feeling of being in the woods, that sense of alertness that comes with being in a place where you're not in control. No, this felt deeper. There was something wrong with the air, something heavy. After we'd eaten, we sat in silence around the fire, watching the embers flicker and die as the night grew colder. My two friends were already starting to doze off, and I found myself staring at the fire, lost in thought. The darkness around us felt impenetrable, like it was swallowing everything up. That's when I heard it. A sound, low and rumbling, like a far-off growl. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a lion or a hyena, typical noises for the region. But it didn't quite sound like that. It was deeper, more like a heavy weight moving through the brush, disturbing the ground as it approached. My heart started to race. I shifted in my seat, my eyes darting around the perimeter of our camp, but I saw nothing. The fire crackled, throwing long shadows across the clearing, but there was no movement beyond that. Still, the feeling of being watched never went away. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the wind or some animal moving around in the trees. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The sound grew louder, closer this time. My hands began to sweat, and I fought the urge to look over at my friends, still asleep in their tents. The last thing I wanted was to wake them up in a panic, especially if it turned out to be nothing. But then, the ground began to shake. a deep vibration that traveled through the soles of my boots. Something was coming. I jumped to my feet, heart racing in my chest. The fire flickered as the wind picked up, casting long shadows around us. I didn't know what to expect, but I instinctively grabbed a nearby branch, holding it like a makeshift weapon, though I knew it wouldn't do much against whatever was heading our way. And then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement, large, dark shapes moving between the trees, just on the edge of the firelight. The first thing I noticed were the glowing eyes, 2 pinpricks of light, staring back at me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. There were at least 2 of them. They weren't moving like animals. They were deliberate, their heavy bodies pushing through the underbrush, each step creating a deep thudding sound in the ground. Rhinoceroses. I don't know why I thought of it in that moment. Maybe it was the way they moved. Massive, unhurried, but purposeful. They were closing in on the fire. I could see the way their thick hides blended into the night, their eyes still locked on the flickering flames. They weren't acting aggressively, not yet anyway, but their presence was enough to send a chill down my spine. I was frozen in place, unsure of what to do. The fire was our only defense, our only source of warmth and light. But the rhinoceroses seemed determined to get closer, and the closer they came, the more the fire's glow seemed to dim. I glanced back at my friends. They were still sleeping, unaware of the massive creatures just beyond the trees. I wanted to scream, to wake them, but I was paralyzed by fear. I could hear their low grunts, the sound of their heavy feet crushing the underbrush as they neared the fire. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, one of the rhinoceroses did something I wasn't prepared for. It lowered its head and charged straight for the fire, its massive body crashing through the brush. I jumped back, instinctively raising the branch to defend myself, though I knew it was pointless. The rhino came straight for the flames, and without hesitation, it reared up, using its horn to push through the dirt at the edge of the fire. With one quick motion, it kicked up a huge pile of dirt, sending it flying toward the flames. The fire sputtered, the embers fighting to stay alive against the onslaught of dirt and ash that covered them. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The rhino wasn't attacking us. It wasn't even interested in us. It was focused on the fire. It had come all the way from the brush just to stamp out the flames. I held my breath, watching in disbelief as the creature repeated the motion, kicking more dirt toward the fire. And within minutes, the fire was completely out, the last of the embers smothered under a thick blanket of dirt. The rhinoceros, satisfied with its work, turned and lumbered off into the darkness, its massive body fading into the shadows. The ground still vibrated slightly from the weight of its movements, but otherwise, the camp was silent. The only sound now was the cold wind rustling through the trees. I stood there in stunned silence, staring at the dark patch where the fire had been just moments ago. I felt the weight of the situation settle in. My only source of warmth and light, gone in an instant, and all because of a rhinoceros. I slowly turned and made my way back to my friends, waking them up as quietly as I could. We didn't speak of what had happened. There was no need to. The darkness was thicker now, and the fire was gone. We packed up our things quickly, the chill in the air settling over us. As we made our way back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling of the rhino's eyes, glowing in the dark. It had been an animal, yes, but in a way it had been a reminder of how small we were out here in the wild. And in the cold, quiet dark, there's no telling what other creatures might be watching, waiting for their chance to come and snuff out the flame. We had been planning this trip for weeks, hoping to get away from everything for a while. A few of my friends and I had decided to head into the woods of northern Georgia for a long weekend of camping. We weren't the kind of guys who camped in well-traveled areas or busy campsites. We liked the challenge of more isolated places, where the trees grew thick and the trails weren't marked as clearly. The weather was perfect for it, cool but not too cold, and the trees had started to turn, giving the woods that golden glow that only fall could bring. The sound of leaves crunching underfoot and the smell of damp earth mixed with pine made it feel like the perfect escape. We hiked in for about 5 miles along an old trail that didn't see much traffic and set up camp beside a small stream. It wasn't a huge area, just enough space for our tents and a fire pit. We gathered wood, got a fire going, and made dinner. The warmth from the fire was comforting, especially as the temperature dropped with the setting sun. We sat around the fire, ate our meals, and spent the evening enjoying the stillness of the woods. There was something peaceful about it. The way the fire crackled and popped, the way the shadows shifted with the flickering light. The evening had that kind of slow, natural rhythm that I always found relaxing. We talked about everything and nothing at all. It wasn't until we were finishing up our drinks and starting to wind down that I noticed the sound. It was soft at first, almost like a rustle in the leaves. I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer moving through the underbrush. But then the sound came again, a bit louder this time, closer to the fire. I looked around. My friends were all sitting around the fire, half asleep, but I noticed that none of them were paying attention to the noise. I didn't want to bring it up right away. Maybe it was just some animal. After all, we were deep in the woods. The thought of an animal didn't really bother me. What bothered me, though, was how quiet everything else was. The wind had died down completely, and there were no more sounds of wildlife. It was almost as if the whole forest was holding its breath. Then the noise came again. This time it was closer. I could feel it more than I could hear it, a disturbance in the stillness of the night. I turned my head slowly, scanning the darkness just beyond the reach of the firelight. First, I saw nothing. The trees stood tall and unmoving, their shadows stretching far into the woods. But then I saw movement, something small and low to the ground. It was hard to make out in the darkness, but there was definitely something there. My mind raced as I tried to process it. It wasn't a deer. It was too small for that, but it wasn't a raccoon either. It was something bigger. The figure moved closer, and that's when I realized what it was. 2 sets of glowing eyes appeared just on the edge of the firelight. Eyes that seemed unnaturally bright, almost glowing. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I held my breath, not wanting to make a sound. Whatever it was coming closer. The eyes shifted, moving toward the fire. The rest of the body came into view, a large, shaggy form with long limbs and a heavy body. It was too big to be a raccoon or a fox. It was something else, something wild, something dangerous. For a few moments, I could hardly move, caught in the surreal terror of the situation. I looked over at my friends, hoping they had noticed, but they were too busy yawning or checking their phones. No one was paying attention. I was the only one who had seen whatever this thing was, and the longer I stared at it, the more I began to realize what it was doing. It was circling the fire. The creature didn't seem to have any interest in us, though. It wasn't making any aggressive moves toward us, at least not yet. But it was circling the fire, moving with purpose, nudging its snout at the edge of the dying embers. I could see it more clearly now. It wasn't a wolf, but it had the build of one long, strong limbs, a thick coat of fur, and those eyes that glowed unnaturally in the dark. But something about it felt off. It wasn't behaving like a normal animal. It was almost like it was trying to figure out the fire. I held my breath as it stepped closer to the fire, its huge paws making no sound on the forest floor. It was slow, deliberate, and I couldn't help but watch as it got closer to the dying flames. The fire had been burning brightly just an hour ago, but now it was reduced to a weak flicker, a few struggling embers. I watched wide-eyed as the creature nudged its nose down, then kicked dirt toward the fire. At first, it seemed like a random act, but then it did it again and again. It wasn't just sniffing at the fire, it was trying to put it out. It kicked dirt onto the embers with such force that it was clear it was intentional. There was no way this was just some curious animal. This was deliberate. The creature seemed to know what it was doing, and I realized with a sickening feeling in my stomach that it wasn't just concerned about the fire. It was trying to put it out. The fire was the only thing keeping us safe out here in the woods. Without it, we were vulnerable. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as the creature kicked dirt again, this time with more force, and I realized it was working to extinguish the last of the warmth and light we had. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't make a sound or move, not without drawing its attention. But I couldn't just sit there either. It was a terrifying realization. Whatever it wasn't just some curious animal. It was something smarter, something that understood the fire was important. I finally shifted, trying to get the attention of my friends without making too much noise. My hand brushed against a rock, and it scraped loudly across the ground. The creature froze, its glowing eyes locking onto me. For a split second, we both stared at each other. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I couldn't breathe. But just as quickly as it had stopped, the creature turned and disappeared into the darkness. I didn't dare move. I stayed frozen for what felt like an eternity, my eyes locked on the dark spot where it had vanished. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped to my feet and rushed to the fire, throwing a log onto the embers. The fire flared up briefly, casting shadows across the clearing. When I turned back to look at my friends, they were still sitting there, completely oblivious. They hadn't noticed a thing. My pulse was still racing, but there was nothing I could say. It wouldn't have made sense. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting for another chance to snuff out the fire. As we packed up the next morning, I couldn't get over how real that experience felt. It wasn't some fantasy. There was something out there in the woods, something that knew the importance of the fire. We left that campsite quickly, and even though I tried to push it from my mind, I couldn't forget the glowing eyes in the dark, or the way that creature had worked to put out the fire. Whatever it was, it had understood exactly what it was doing. When we got back to the trailhead, I was relieved to be out of those woods. I didn't know what it was or what it wanted, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. The forest, the fire, that thing in the darkness, it was all too real and it was too close for comfort. And I knew one thing for sure. Next time we went camping, we'd be a lot more careful with our fire. Because out there, in the dark, there's something that watches. And it doesn't want you to be too comfortable. We've always liked to push our limits, especially when it came to hiking. For years, we'd been going deeper into Georgia's woods, sometimes on trails that were barely maintained or completely off the beaten path. We liked the solitude, the sense of being far from civilization, and the challenge of navigating the rugged terrain. This trip was no different. We'd hiked about 3 to 5 miles down a trailhead, deep into the woods where most people wouldn't venture. It had been an unusually chilly fall evening for Georgia, but that didn't stop us from setting up camp. We'd pitched our tents near a small clearing by a creek, the kind of place that felt isolated but not too far from the trail. The wind had been picking up as we gathered wood, the scent of pine and damp leaves mixing with the crisp air. We managed to get a decent fire going, nothing too big, but enough to keep us warm and comfortable. We cooked up some food, ate our fill, and settled in as the night began to take over. The temperature had dropped into the low 20s, which was really rare for mid-fall in Georgia, but we didn't think much of it. We had good sleeping bags and warm clothes, and we figured the fire would keep us warm enough. The fire crackled as we sat around it, our faces lit by the orange glow. We shared some stories, laughed a bit, and eventually, one by one, we drifted off to sleep. The warmth from the fire mixed with the comfort of a full stomach, and soon enough, I was completely out. I remember the last thing I thought before falling asleep was how quiet the woods were, how still everything seemed, and how comforting that silence felt. I don't know how much time had passed when I woke up. The cold had already crept in, and I could feel it seeping through the fabric of my sleeping bag. My first instinct was to reach for the zipper and close it tighter, but before I could do that, I felt something tap the top of my foot. It was soft at first, then again, tap, tap. I slowly opened my eyes and looked up. It was my buddy, Jake. He wasn't exactly the type to startle easily, so seeing him awake at this hour caught me off guard. His face was partially illuminated by the dying fire, the shadows of the trees around us making the whole place feel even darker and more isolated than before. Without a word, he nodded toward the fire. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it. There were 2 wild boars, maybe 15 yards away from the fire, rooting around in the dirt. Their large bodies blocked out the last bit of light from the embers, casting long, dark shadows on the ground. They were focused on the fire pit, kicking up dirt and snorting, their tusks glinting in the dim light. My first thought was that we needed to move, to make some noise, anything to scare them away. But then I remembered how aggressive wild boars can be, especially in Georgia. These things weren't your average deer or raccoon. They weighed easily 150 pounds, if not more, and their temper was a lot shorter. If they felt threatened, they wouldn't hesitate to charge. Jake and I just lay there as still as possible, watching them. The boars moved around the fire pit, rooting through the ashes, their large hooves scraping against the rocks. We both kept perfectly still, not daring to make a sound. It was the kind of quiet where even your own breath felt loud. Every now and then, one of them would grunt or snort, and it would make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We didn't have any sort of weaponry on us. Our hand axe was tucked away near the fire, out of reach. Our knives were in our packs, and the boars were too close for us to make a move. The last thing we wanted was to startle them, especially with them so close to the dying fire. If they got riled up, there was no telling what could happen. I turned to Jake, who was lying beside me, barely breathing, eyes wide, and staring at the boars. I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. Don't move, don't make a sound. The boars seemed to be oblivious to us, completely focused on whatever they were sniffing around for. There was something unnerving about the way they moved, slow, deliberate, as if they didn't have a care in the world. They were wild animals, unpredictable, and they could turn hostile at any moment. Time seemed to stretch on forever as we lay there, not daring to make a move. The fire had burned down to almost nothing, the orange glow of the embers flickering weakly in the cold air. It wasn't just the boars that made the whole situation tense. It was the silence of the night, the dark forest pressing in around us. The cold was starting to get to me, but I didn't want to move, didn't want to risk attracting attention. For about an hour, we just lay there. I could feel my limbs stiffening from the cold, but I didn't dare shift, not even to rub my hands together. Every so often, one of the boars would grunt, snorting loudly and pawing at the ground. It sounded almost like a low growl, but I couldn't tell if it was just the way they were rooting around or if they were getting agitated. Either way, I didn't want to find out. The fire continued to die down, and the light from it grew weaker, casting long, eerie shadows that stretched out over the ground. My thoughts were racing. I tried to think of what we could do if the boars decided to come closer, but nothing seemed like a good option. Our only choice was to remain as still and quiet as possible, hoping they would lose interest. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the boars seemed to lose interest in the fire pit. One of them grunted loudly and turned, heading back into the woods with the other following behind it. They moved off into the darkness, their heavy bodies disappearing into the night as quietly as they had come. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My body was stiff from lying in one position for so long, and my heart was still pounding in my chest. For a moment, neither of us moved. We just stared into the darkness, making sure the boars were really gone. After a minute, Jake finally let out a long sigh. "That was close," he muttered under his breath. I nodded, still trying to calm my racing heart. We didn't speak much after that, both of us too shaken by the close call. The fire had almost completely gone out by now, and the temperature was dropping even further. We knew we couldn't sleep with the boars that close, so we decided to stoke the fire back up before it completely died. We both sat up and quietly worked together to gather more wood and get the fire going again. The crackling flames felt comforting now, warming us against the chill that had crept into the night air. We kept the fire going for the rest of the night, neither of us able to shake the feeling that something else was out there in the woods with us. The boars might have moved on, but we weren't sure if we were truly safe. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. We didn't sleep much, not after what had happened, and when morning finally came, we both packed up our gear quickly. The sun had barely risen, and the air was still cold, but we were both ready to get out of there. We didn't even talk much as we broke camp. We had seen firsthand how dangerous those woods could be, how unpredictable the wild boars were. As we hiked back to the trailhead, we didn't look back at the campsite. We didn't need to. The whole experience was a reminder of just how wild and unforgiving the forest could be. Even in a place like Georgia, where the woods seem to be mostly tamed, you could still find danger in the most unexpected places. We made it back to the truck without incident, but the memory of the wild boars, of those tense hours in the cold night, stayed with me long after we left the woods behind. It wasn't just the danger of the animals that bothered me. It was the way the woods had felt that night. How quiet, how still, how close the wilderness had seemed. The air was colder than usual for a late spring night when I pulled my truck into the small, gravel lot near the edge of the woods. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. Just me, a few days in the wild, away from the noise and distractions of daily life. No phone service, no people, just the sounds of nature. I had picked a remote campsite deep in the woods, one that required a little hike to get to, which made it feel all the more isolated. The further from civilization, the better. The camp was situated near an old logging trail, its entrance barely noticeable behind a cluster of overgrown shrubs. From the moment I parked and stepped out of the truck, I could feel the stillness. The usual sounds of birds or insects were muffled, replaced by a strange quiet, almost as if the forest was holding its breath. I grabbed my backpack from the truck and started walking down the narrow trail leading to the site. The path was uneven, and the old trees overhead blocked most of the fading sunlight, casting the ground in a soft, cool shadow. The smell of damp earth and pine needles filled the air, and despite the eerie quiet, there was something peaceful about the whole thing. It felt like I was the only one in the world. When I arrived at the campsite, it was everything I had hoped for. A small clearing surrounded by thick woods, a few fallen logs to sit on, and a stream running a few yards away, barely audible over the sounds of my own footsteps. I set my pack down and began to set up my tent, enjoying the simplicity of it all. There was no rush. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, and I still had plenty of time before darkness fully set in. As I worked, I kept feeling a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. It wasn't anything specific, just a nagging feeling at the back of my mind, like I was being watched. I laughed it off at first, reminding myself that I was alone in the woods, where everything seems a little more intense at night. I managed to get my tent up and set the small campfire pit, arranging some wood in a small pile, hoping to get a fire going before the temperature dropped too much. With the sun almost gone, I pulled out some snacks from my pack and sat on one of the logs, staring into the growing shadows of the trees. It was then that I first heard it, a sound, faint at first, like something large moving through the underbrush. I tensed, my gaze snapping to the woods around me. The noise stopped, my heart pounded in my chest, but I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than a deer or maybe a raccoon. But the feeling in the air had shifted. The woods were no longer the calm, peaceful place they had been when I first arrived. Now they felt alive, shifting, aware. I started the fire and watched the flames crackle to life, feeling the heat as the fire began to spread across the small pile of wood. The light flickered and danced, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. I tried to distract myself by pulling out my phone to check for any signal, but of course, there was nothing. Not that I was expecting it, but a little piece of me had hoped for just a sliver of connection to the outside world. I shoved the phone back into my pocket and let out a frustrated sigh. The fire crackled and popped, its warmth making the cool night air feel more bearable. I leaned back on the log, staring at the flames, when the sound came again, this time closer, a sharp snap of a twig. I froze, my hand instinctively going to the knife at my side. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe it was just an animal, but why was it so close? And why had it stopped so suddenly when I noticed it? I strained my ears, trying to listen over the crackling of the fire. The woods around me felt too still now, too quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then, in the corner of my vision, I saw it. A shape, darker than the shadows around it, moving slowly through the trees. It was large, too large to be a deer. My heart skipped a beat. The shape moved silently, barely a rustle of leaves or a creak of branches. For a split second, I thought it might be a bear, but something about the way it moved, so smoothly with purpose, didn't sit right. Bears don't move like that. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly stood, trying not to make any noise. The firelight flickered, casting strange shapes against the trees. The shape was closer now, just beyond the reach of the light. It was standing on all fours, large, muscular, and unnaturally still. For a moment, I was frozen, not knowing what to do. I thought about getting in the tent, but I knew that wouldn't do anything. It wouldn't keep whatever this thing was out. And running was just asking for trouble. I grabbed the hatchet from my pack, trying to steady my shaking hands. I had no idea what I was dealing with, but I wasn't about to just sit there and wait to find out. My mind raced through all the stories I had heard growing up, the strange ones about things that roamed the woods at night, things you were never supposed to see. Werewolves, they called them. I shook my head, trying to push the thought out of my mind. That was ridiculous. There was no way something like that could exist. But the figure was still there, moving, slowly creeping closer. It had stopped trying to hide itself now. I could see its silhouette clearly. A massive, hunched shape, with broad shoulders and a head that seemed to hover unnaturally between animal and something else. I couldn't see its face, but the outline was unmistakable. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't any animal I recognized. I gripped the hatchet tighter, my palms sweating. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to run as fast as I could. But I couldn't move. My body refused to cooperate. It was as if I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the creature. The sound of its heavy breathing filled the air now, louder, closer. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My muscles were tense, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature moved again. But this time, it didn't step back into the woods. It took one long, deliberate step forward, revealing its full size in the firelight. I finally saw its face. Its eyes glowed a faint yellow, and its muzzle was long and wolf-like, but twisted, distorted, and full of menace. Its teeth were sharp, gleaming white against the dark fur that covered its face and body. It stood there for a long moment, studying me, its eyes never leaving mine. Then, with a low growl, it turned and disappeared into the darkness, vanishing like a shadow in the trees. I stood there, heart hammering in my chest, not knowing what to do. I could hear the creature moving deeper into the woods, but the forest was silent again, almost as if it had never happened. The only sound now was my ragged breathing and the crackling of the fire. I stayed up the rest of the night, staring into the darkness, my hatchet still clutched tightly in my hand. I couldn't bring myself to sleep. There was no way I could relax, not after what I had seen. When morning finally came, I packed up quickly, my hands shaking as I shoved my gear into my backpack. The sun was already high in the sky, but the forest felt different now, more open, less threatening. The normal sounds of birds and rustling leaves returned, and for the first time since I arrived, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't waste any time leaving. I hiked back down the trail to the parking lot, every step feeling like a relief. When I finally reached the truck, I didn't look back. I didn't care if the campsite was safe now, or if the creature had left for good. All I cared about was getting out of there. I haven't gone back to those woods since. Every time I think about it, I remember that moment in the firelight, those glowing eyes staring back at me. And every time, I wonder just what it was I saw that night.